Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 and 4. What constitutes a cost-effective mining scheme? Once two or more alternatives are available, selection of a cost-effective mining scheme implies some objective measure of comparison. This chapter will cover key elements, characteristics, and methods of evaluation that will result in cost-effective mine planning. For initial evaluation, the key elements of any cost-effective mining scheme can be characterized into these four groupings. So first of all, the operating cost characteristics. Low operating costs mean greater cash flow. It also means that you can weather variability in market prices better than your competition. You can incur some losses, but your competition will be losing more money. So you can achieve lower operating costs through more capital-intensive mining schemes, but it may reduce your flexibility. If you have a lot of money tied up in equipment that brings you greater efficiencies, you may not be able to change the course or change course if conditions on the ground change because of all the money you've tied up. The second one, capital requirements. Let's talk a little bit more about capital. The term capital intensive is used to describe investments for which there's an additional expenditure of resources now with the expectation of lower costs later. So it implies high fixed costs. High initial capital expenditures may reduce risk or set up a mine for easier expandability, but higher capital costs may mean greater financial risk, especially in unstable political environments. As mentioned earlier, high capital costs may result in less ability to change with changes in the market. So on page 18 and 19 in your book, they talk about delayed capital expenditure. And if all other things are equal, delayed capital expenditure is a desirable objective since capital incurred later has a lower cost in present value terms. We get into present value when we get into Chapter 5. But if you can delay it, it basically costs less now. The third one, excuse me, sensitivity to change. The future never materializes according to any one plan or set of plans. We know that. Yet shareholder value is directly related to how consistently businesses perform year in and year out, despite changes occurring around them. This robustness in the face of change may be an inherent characteristic of a deposit, but more often it's a function of, first, the mining method and equipment chosen, second, whether this equipment or method is adaptable or not, and third, what institutional constraints are placed on adaptation. In most mining applications, the key factors impacting mine economics that are outside the direct control of the company are the market price, the volume, exchange rates, and mineral deposit characteristics. The fourth one is knowledge and philosophy of the owner. Have you ever noticed how many mining properties change hands and are under new ownership on an annual basis? Just look at the Powder River Basin as an example. Cloud Peak used to be Rio Tinto, which used to be Kennecott. Alpha Coal West used to be part of Foundation Coal. Those of you who have experienced these changes have gone through the changes in corporate culture as well. The text gives an example on page 21 of oil companies buying into coal mining in the late 70s and early 80s, considering these investments an extension of the energy business. However, by the mid-1990s, almost all these companies sold their coal interests as they couldn't assimilate them into their corporate culture. Their culture was much different in the oil business than what was really necessary in the coal mining business. They found the production side of mining is far different than the oil business, obviously. This drawing, which is on page 24 of your book, it may be a little bit intimidating, but it's illustrative of the iterative nature of the mine planning process. By following the circular process, you can see why it makes sense. You start with the basic data. So up here at the top, the basic data that you need to make decisions, geological, metallurgical, marketing, etc. Based on guidelines from management, you enter the mine design process. So from the basic data, here's the guidelines for management. Enter the mine design process. You lay out the mine. You decide on the equipment needs. You put together the production and the operating schedules. You finalize your operating costs and capital costs, and then you evaluate how it is going, and then based on what you learned, evaluate the alternatives and begin developing guidelines for the next phase. So it just keeps going. Progressing from one phase of the evaluation to the next is not simply a matter of increased precision based on your experiences, but it will eliminate other alternatives from contention that might point you in an entirely different direction. This is why it is important to properly evaluate your options at the early broad brush and strategic planning stages, where you have the greatest number of alternatives, so you don't incorrectly eliminate some potentially viable options. If you look on page 26, on figure 3-2, that focuses on the evaluation task. And this task applies for every phase of the process. So on this PowerPoint, you keep going through the evaluation phase. And every time you go through these same steps, the mine layout, the mine equipment scheduling, mine costing, you go back through the evaluation, and then you make new, then you continue on to the next phase. So the courses of action open after any evaluation. These are what could happen. You could implement the proposal. You could examine the proposal in more detail and proceed to the next study, seeking more reliability and estimates prior to making a decision. Or you can examine more alternatives. Fourth one, certainly you can abandon the project. So the first phase of the evaluation, the broad brush planning, is aimed at providing the guidelines for exploration. You may literally examine hundreds of mining scenarios at this point, but the reliability and cost terms may be within plus or minus 20%, assuming the mine plans themselves can actually be implemented. They can only be determined after a detailed feasibility study. Table 3-1, I should have said this earlier, but Table 3-1 on page 25 outlines the phases of the planning cycle. And so we'll talk about the first three, and then the rest of the book is concentrated on the rest of those. Phase 2 is the strategic planning. The second phase fills a critical role in optimizing the plan. It sets in place the fundamental economic structure for the entire mine. And the priority in this phase of the planning cycle is to ensure three things. Excuse me. First of all, the understanding of what characterizes this mine compared to other mines, and what characterizes this mine's products as judged by the customer, and adoption of a strategy that maximizes its value. The second thing, development of the mine itself with sufficient scope for change. Most mines are developed around a selected base case, and the equipment sizing and development strategy are optimized for the base case estimate of market demand. Even so, change is inevitable, and management must be ready for implementing changes in the mine in line with what is happening in the real world. And the third objective of the strategic planning process is to understand which of these characteristics impacts the mine economics the most. As a guideline for following stages of the planning, costs may then be optimized for those elements of the mine plan that are most controllable. Once the strategies are in place and the economics and risks associated with those strategies are clearly understood, then the details can be addressed in a long-term planning and feasibility phase. The key word for this and subsequent phases is implementability. Ooh, that's a tough word. And issues to be addressed here are, to be addressed in these phases: equipment selection, mine development, particularly the detailed layout of the mine and simulation of the revenue stream for the first few years when the cash flows are most sensitive. The next one, optimization of bench heights, widths, access constraints, and scheduling alternatives. Also, yearly, monthly, and shorter term planning. And finally, economic guidelines for short-term operational decisions. So these issues are addressed in the balance of the book. So that's the end of chapter 3. Really quick chapter, but there's some good examples in there, and you can look in your book and read those to give you a little bit more help. Chapter 4 deals with the cost. We're going to look at costs in a different way in this chapter. So now we're actually getting into the heart of this and the economic part of this. To most of us, cost is the amount of money that we take out of our wallet and buy something. So if you pay $3 for your latte at Starbucks, that transaction doesn't involve any more thought than what you intended. Since purchasing a small item on its own doesn't preclude you from purchasing anything else later on, for larger items, the real cost is more evident. So if you buy a new car today, you may not be able to afford the beach vacation next summer that we all dream about. The real cost of the car is the loss of enjoyment from the vacation that will no longer be possible. So we will be looking at the differences between common concepts of cost and the economic concept of cost. So in economics, the cost of anything is the highest valued opportunity necessarily forsaken. We call it opportunity costs. Some major categories of costs that are considered include capital costs, which are the equipment, tools, machinery, physical facilities that make it possible to produce your product. Operating costs, which are the day-to-day costs for people operating and maintaining your equipment and utilities. Development costs, which simply stated is every dollar you spend before you produce your first ton of coal. And then finally, taxes, royalties, and fees associated with producing your product. The chart here shows that the state of Wyoming received over $1 billion from coal mining in 2008. I looked for a new one. They didn't have a new one, so I apologize for that. This is the latest one that I have. Finally, let's look at different types of costs, because you definitely need to know what these mean. So fixed costs are costs that don't vary with the level of output. Doesn't matter how many tons of coal you produce, your fixed costs never change. Annual payments to maintain a mine lease, construction of a high voltage power line, those are some examples of fixed costs. Recoverable costs is self-defined. When you trade in or sell a piece of equipment, the money you receive is a recoverable cost, period. Sunk costs are the non-recoverable part of a fixed cost. Sunk costs usually refer to one-time investments that must be made in entering a market, have no residual value if the firm exits the market. The car that you bought, that's pretty much a sunk cost. However, if you can get some money back when you trade it in for another car or you sell it outright, that's recoverable. The other part of that is sunk. You can't do anything about it. It's already spent. Variable costs are costs that change with the level of output. Typically, as output increases, so does the need for labor, fuel, electricity, and materials. Those are examples of variable costs. Opportunity cost is the cost of an alternative that must be foregone. So you're giving it up in order to pursue a certain action. Put another way, benefits you could have received by taking an alternative action. As an example, if a gardener decides to grow carrots, his or her opportunity cost is the alternative crop that might have been grown. So potatoes, tomatoes, pumpkins, etc. So opportunities is what you are giving up when you make a decision. External costs are those that are not considered by the mind as those costs that are borne by others. These are externalities, is what you can call them also. For example, increased traffic on a road to a new mine might require more maintenance by the county of the road. Those costs are external to the mine, but they are additional costs. Another example is pollution. Pollution is an externality. It's a cost to a third party or a bystander, if you want to call it that. Finally, the marginal cost is the change in total cost. This is the incremental cost, the additional cost. Few concepts are more important than in economics than the concept of marginal cost, and along with that, marginal revenue. And so those are the types of costs, and that pretty much concludes chapter 4. So thank you, and stay tuned for the next chapter.